Diffusion, the international science radio show.
We have a bouncer on the doors of perception.
The good, the bad, the ugly.
It gets pretty exciting.
The myths, the truths.
Toxicology.
Astroseismology.
Magnetism. The dark side.
Genetically engineered potatoes.
Planetoid.
Planetoid.
I love that word.
Hello and welcome to Diffusion. Sit back and relax while we inject weird and wonderful science directly into your genes. I'm Ian Woolf. On this edition, Claire Hooker starts part 1 of the story of pioneer radio astronomer Ruby Payne-Scott. But first up, here's the news about octopus villages and ultrasonic attacks on your phone. Octopolis and Octolantis are real. Previously thought to be solitary antisocial animals, gloomy octopuses have been seen living in settlements of 15 in a second site in Jervis Bay in New South Wales. These cohabiting octopuses have been recorded having complex communications, either directly as in evicting other octopuses from their dens, or indirectly through posturing, chasing, or colour changes. Male and female octopuses are known to mate and then never interact with each other again. They were thought to avoid all others until mating time. In 2009, Peter Godfrey Smith and Matthew Lawrence reported on a settlement of gloomy octopus, Octopus tetricus, centred around a 30cm metal artefact on a wide, flat, sandy area at the bottom of the ocean, with just a few rock outcroppings around. The researchers named the settlement Octopolis. Octopuses need to dig dens where they can shelter near hard defences against predators. It was thought that maybe the introduction of the human artefact had changed the octopus's behaviour. However, the new site doesn't have any human artefacts, just a rock outcropping in the middle of a smooth, flat, sandy area with lots of food. The second settlement is a few hundred metres away from Octopolis, and the researchers have named it Octolantis. The site is about 10 to 15 metres under the water's surface and is about 18 metres in length and 4 metres wide. Once octopuses have lived there for a while, they build up a midden of shells from the prey they've eaten. This provides hard material for other octopuses to dig and sculpt their own dens, and the settlement grows. A total of 13 occupied and 10 unoccupied octopus dens were found at the Octolantis site. The team from Alaska Pacific University, the University of Guelph, the University of Wollongong and the University of Sydney placed 4 action cameras around Octolantis to film the behaviour of the octopuses for 10 hours. Some of the octopuses were seen evicting other individuals from their dens, and then after the evicted octopus had taken refuge in a den further away, the aggressor went and evicted it again. There were some displays where an individual would stretch itself out lengthwise in an upright posture and its mantle would darken. Often, another octopus observing this behaviour would quickly swim away. A great deal of energy is exerted during antagonistic behaviour, and it could lead to a potential risk of injury to the octopus or make them more vulnerable to predators, so surely it must have some benefit. Octopus social behaviour is too new a subject for anyone to know what it means. The discovery of Octolantis lends weight to the idea that limited opportunities to build dens protected by hard things amidst abundant food availability leads to high density living and complex interactions, where for octopuses high density living means up to 16 individuals. At both sites, octopuses have formed a shell bed surrounding a hard structure. Where this isn't the environment, they seem to choose to live alone, only coming together to mate. Female octopuses protect their eggs against predators and then die shortly after the eggs hatch. Male octopuses die a few months after mating. Gloomy octopuses live about 3 years. Octopolis and Octolantis are real, but there's no signs of the fabled octopus's garden. The paper was published in the journal Marine and Freshwater Behaviour and Physiology and was titled A second site occupied by Octopus tetricus at higher densities with notes on their ecology and behaviour. Attacked with a dolphin whisper. Security researchers from Zhejiang University have shown that devices that respond to voice commands like Siri, Google Now, Cortana, Samsung S Voice, Huawei Hi Voice, and Alexa can be subverted by converting voice commands into ultrasonic frequencies. The human owners can't hear the commands, but the devices will still obey the commands. They call this way to take over a device with ultrasonic voice commands DolphinAttack. Ultrasonics are sounds above 20 kHz, which is the highest frequency that young humans can hear. The researchers demonstrated that voice commands converted with phone software and $3 worth of amplifier and tiny speaker could make a phone visit a malicious website, send fake messages and posts in your name, activate Apple Siri to initiate a FaceTime video call to spy on you, activate Google Now to switch the Android phone to cut off your access to networks, and even manipulate the navigation system in an Audi car to hijack you. They could even dim the screen and lower the volume so you couldn't tell your screen was misbehaving. Previous researchers had claimed that as most devices sample sounds at 44.1 kHz and use a low-pass filter to ignore anything above 20 kHz, they won't be able to detect ultrasonic commands, and they should be safe. The problem is that microphones are non-linear, which means they can distort what they hear. So a microphone can distort sound in a way that converts high frequencies into low frequencies, allowing the ultrasonic whisper to become a command. Out of the 17 devices they tested, only the iPhone 6 Plus microphone blocked ultrasound commands. The researchers list some hardware and software modifications that could stop a dolphin attack taking over your voice-commanded system. A silent voice speaks and your smartphone, smart home or smart car betrays you. The paper was titled DolphinAttack, Inaudible Voice Commands and was presented at the ACM Conference on Computer and Communications Security. You're listening to Ian Woolf on Diffusion Science Radio. Send emails to science@diffusionradio.com. We're brought to you across Australia on the Community Radio Network and podcast over the internet on www.diffusionradio.com. Next up, part 1 of the story of pioneer of radio astronomy, Ruby Payne-Scott. Claire Hooker is Senior Lecturer in Health and Medical Humanities at Sydney Health Ethics in the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney, with an interest in the history of women in science, technology, engineering and maths. I began by asking her, when did Ruby Payne-Scott start her career?
Ruby was born in 1912, so that meant that she was going to school and university in the 1920s. So this is a period in which Australia was still a relatively small nation, even still a newish nation. And there are two issues that make Ruby's career noticeable and impressive, one of which was that scientific careers and higher education in Australia was still in those days extremely limited. So there was a university in each of the capital cities. The science departments were all built in about the 1880s. So there was still only a generation having been established. They were still pretty small. Numbers of science graduates were very small. If you wanted to do a higher degree or a research degree, none were available in Australia. You had to pretty much return to what they referred to as capital H, home, meaning England, during that period. And Ruby not only completed a Bachelor of Science degree, but majored in physics. And jobs in physics in that age were virtually non-existent for anyone. And of course, then there is that extra statement, least of all for a young woman. And access to higher education in those days for women was also limited, not a great deal more so than for men. But career prospects in the area in which you trained was when the the sex differences really come into play.
So it was a brave choice.
It was a brave choice, yes. Yes. Ruby was one of those outstanding characters for whom nothing was ever going to get in her way. Her whole life was rather courageous in that sense. So I presume at that stage that she was simply driven by her own interest, curiosity, and considerable talents.
And she didn't start in astronomy?
No, indeed, she did not. So in the 1920s, all astronomy was optical only. It was just what you could see through a telescope. And there were telescope facilities around the country. And indeed, of course, Australia, even in optical astronomy, had a small but distinguished part to play by virtue of having access to the southern skies when the bulk of astronomical research was conducted in the Northern Hemisphere. Nonetheless, the colonial or post-colonial, that is state-based observatories, were still very small. They had hardly any resources and were largely devoted to meteorological observations. So this is the beginning of weather bureaus and that kind of thing. And there was no obvious pathway from a degree in physics to a job in astronomy either.
So what did she work on as a physicist, just graduating in a country with little work for physicists?
Yeah, she spent the first 3 years after graduation with an actual job doing physics, which in itself was genuinely amazing. It was within the university in a research group, and her work was as a medical physicist on what was actually a fairly disastrous research project into cancer treatments using radiation therapy.
And so how did she switch to astronomy?
That is a long story. After her period in medical physics, she became a school teacher, and she moved to Adelaide to do that, to become a science mistress. So that is in itself indicative of the intersection of three pressures: the depression, which meant jobs for anybody were scarce, the no jobs in physics, and the no jobs for women. So they all came together and she became a school teacher. And it was World War II that changed things. So Australia entered the war with Britain, and immediately, so that's in 1939, and that immediately began to put pressure on industries that might have wartime applications. In this case, one of the main industries in the 1930s was an industry it was a company called Amalgamated Wireless Australasia. So this is a company that specialised in radio. So the 1920s and the 1930s were the great era of radio, and the era of the amateur ham radio operator and the use of radio in different company settings. And this one company, AWA, was the major supplier in that industry. And the outbreak of war, there was considerable interest from the military in radio-related projects, even just the installation of radio communication sets on ships, soon in airplanes. That was a new feature, of course, of World War II, was fighting using planes, and between army stations and so on. So there was that interest in radio, and Ruby was initially hired by AWA as a librarian. But it did not take very long for her excellent skills as a hands-on engineer and doing research-related work in the company became obvious. And by 1941, she applied for and was accepted into a group based in a newly created division within the CSIR, which is what it was known as in those days, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. They created a division with the dummy name Radio Physics. They called it Radio Physics so that spies from Japan and Germany wouldn't guess what they were up to. But what they were up to was radar research. So radar is radio direction research. So that's research into how you can bounce radio waves off objects and locate where they are. So this was initially used to find where ships were. But the pressing issue, of course, in World War II was to try and do that well for finding airplanes. And that's very hard because airplanes are small, much smaller than ships, and they move a lot faster. So trying to work out swiftly by bouncing radio signals signals off them is a challenging task. Even more challenging to do that in tropical stations where you needed to create receivers that won't rust and that will behave in very hot weather, because weather temperature affects the quality of receivers, and where you have to guess what the bandwidth are and so on. So a whole range of pressing and immediate research tasks. And so Ruby and another young woman joined that particular research team and performed admirably within the research group. Now, at that time, by 1939 and during those early war years, there was, apart from one or two people and the couple of people that listened to them, there was no belief or understanding that any radio signals could be received that were not terrestrial. And that's partly because no one had ever observed any. And they also had a theory as to why there would be none. So first of all, they didn't have any theoretical expectation that there would be any radio wave emitting objects in space. So they didn't expect there to be signals in the first place. But even if there were, they knew they could bounce radio signals off the ionosphere. Those were experiments done in the late 1890s and in the first decade of the 20th century. So they viewed the ionosphere as a reflective surface, effectively. So therefore, they thought that if there were any radio signals from space, they would not make it through they wouldn't pass through the ionosphere, so they wouldn't be received.
For the listeners who haven't heard of the ionosphere before, could you give a brief description of what it is?
So here I join your listeners in not being a technical expert, but around the Earth we have an atmosphere that is composed of different kinds of particles at different layers, and some of them occur from the scattering of radiation received from the sun and reflected off the Earth's surface. So one outer portion of that is the ionosphere. And as I say, when radio waves were first identified and then played with by the emergent physicists of the 1890s and the early 20th century, one of the things they did was send out a signal from the UK, not expecting it, expecting nothing to happen, because of course you then have the curvature of the Earth, but actually it was received in North America. So it must have been reflected off the ionosphere. This is what they discovered and seemed amazing at the time. So there were multiple reasons for why there was no expectation that you would experience, that your receivers would pick up radio waves that were extraterrestrial, that is not from Earth, in their origin. Those who are aficionados of this history can discover for themselves that, in fact, one or two people, particularly Karl Jansky and Grote Reber, were the two actual people who did any experiments at all prior to 1939, and their results were known to an extremely limited audience. But aside from that, this was a novel conception. But during the years of fast-paced radar research in the war, there were a few moments both in the radar research group in the UK and here in Australasia where there was evidence that some of the signals were being received, particularly in relation to activity on the sun. And another woman, Elizabeth Alexander, who led the research team in New Zealand, actually did some of the first observations off Norfolk Island in 1943. So the team in Sydney were aware of these data. And in fact, they had made their own primary observation when the leader of the research team, a man named Joe Pawsey, and Ruby, took receivers and pointed them out the window of the Madsen building over here at Sydney Uni to try and measure the temperature of the sky. That was not a particularly successful moment, but it was the first moment where they were already thinking about trying to look for what radio waves might be received from the heavens, widely conceived. And so the moment the war finished and there was this crack team of researchers and a question about what to do with them now that urgent radar research was no longer needed. And Joe Pawsey and the head of that division, Bowen, were prescient enough to suggest that they continue a couple of avenues of research, one of which was to use their receivers to see what they could pick up from extraterrestrial sources. So they took some old radar receivers, antenna, and mounted them on top of a cliff at Dover Heights, north of Bondi. So it's a nice tall cliff, a long way up from the sea. So when they point that receiver at the sky, they receive us whatever waves come down, they will receive that signal directly. But at the same time, they can also get a reflection of the same signal bounced off the sea, as if the sea is treated like a giant reflecting mirror. So you have two signals that are effectively measured at a little distance away from each other, and you can use that to start to make some determinations about where they might come from. And so again, Ruby was one of the team who were established at Dover Heights and quickly began doing some research about receiving radio signals from the sun.
So the sun was the main first target.
The sun was the main first target. That's exactly right. And almost instantly, everything changed in people's perceptions of what was going on. So as it happens, we now know that sunspots come in about an 11-year cycle. And they began their observations close to the sunspot maxima. And not only that, but within the first couple of years, there was an outburst of sunspot activity that is almost unparalleled in the years since, as luck would have it. So there are these extraordinary, known as solar bursts, that began to be correlated with sunspot activity, where you could have this burst, this kind of explosive event where you're measuring radio signals, but it indicates that something of an extraordinary temperature relative to the normal temperature of this, relative to the temperature of the sun is happening.
She determined the patterns in the radiograph that was sort of, at that point, would have been drawn on paper.
Yes, that's right. So people who've done high school physics, which is all I too have done, and this is the only bit that I relate to in the technicalities, but might remember that they might look at interaction effects. So the people were looking for the little fringes that are like when you create a diffraction grating, the little fringes that show you exactly where the signal is bigger or smaller.
Because I know there's different types of radio bursts that a solar astronomer will look for now when there's sunspot activity. There's type 1 and a type 2 and a type 3 and so on. And they're different patterns and they indicate what's going on. From my brief reading on the subject, I believe she had something to do with the categorization.
Yes, in fact, I think most of that categorization was hers, although it was a very collaborative research team, and the basis on which those categorizations were made may well have involved others. Almost all their papers were co-authored with each other, and their results were communally discussed at research meetings. So yes, so she was just basically trying to identify any features. I mean, this really was a period of discovery in a very open-ended sense, because no one knew what they were looking for or what they would find. And of course, their instruments were only set up to measure at specific wavelengths too, and only in particular directions. That is, the bits of the sky you could point your receiver at accurately. And there were limitations around receiver sensitivity and so on. So that they really were just starting to put down any data that they could. One of the features of that early period was also that none of them were astronomers at all. None of them knew any astronomy at all. So this was the beginning of radio astronomy as a science, and it occurred here and it occurred in only 2 other research groups, both of which were in the UK. So Australians really had a head start on this field and have remained very strong in it ever since. And of course it helped that they were the only group observing in the southern skies as well. But it also meant that that one of the enormous challenges of that period was trying to correlate their data with absolutely anything that an optical astronomer would understand. Optical astronomers were I don't know what they were They were not inclined to engage early. They were probably some mixture of befuddled and sceptical at these people who were physicists but not astronomers at all, trying to say meaningful stuff about their field. And it didn't help that those early instruments were not actually able to very finely discriminate the locations of many of the objects that they found. So trying to find any optical correlates was a puzzle that remained for quite a long time, apart from locating the sun, which was why the sun was a good place to start. Everyone knew where that was.
That was Dr. Claire Hooker, Senior Lecturer in Health and Medical Humanities in the School of Public Health at the University of Sydney. She'll present the second and final part of the story of Ruby Payne-Scott next week. And that's all from us this week on Diffusion. Would you like to hear your voice on radio? Record a voice memo on your phone or use the voicemail tab on the website. We need more people contributing stories to Diffusion. Send your contributions, opinions, helpful suggestions and donations to science@diffusionradio.com. That's science@diffusionradio.com. And please do send me an email so I know you're listening and you'd like to hear more episodes. Please like the Diffusion Science Radio page on Facebook and rate the show on iTunes. Tell your friends. Follow me on Twitter @Ian Woolf. Join my patrons in supporting the show at patreon.com/diffusionradio. The news music was Rynos theme by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. Checking production was Charles Willock. I produce Diffusion, which is broadcast around Australia to 27 stations on the Community Radio Network, including 2RBM in the Blue Mountains of New South Wales, 8CCC in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek, 2NVR in Nambucca Valley, and 3MBR in the Mallee Border districts of Victoria and South Australia. Diffusion is syndicated globally on the National Science Foundation's Science 360 internet radio station and also on astronomy.fm. Subscribe to our podcast on the Diffusion website, www.diffusionradio.com. That's www.diffusionradio.com, and check the website for links, photos and videos about this week's show. And if you enjoyed the show, you can explore more than 900 previous episodes archived on diffusionradio.com, where the shows are labelled by keywords so you can focus in on the stories you want to hear. Subscribe to the Diffusion YouTube channel at youtube.com/c/diffusionradio. I'm Ian Woolf. Join us inside your audio device of choice for more science wondering next week on Diffusion Science Radio.
Science is fun. It helps you to learn, to know, and to appreciate. When you study science, you may go on field trips. You discover the marvelous interrelationships between all living things. You learn to read the history of the Earth as it is written in rocks and fossils. You find out what makes things tick, everything from a molecule to a living organism. In the study of science is found the most useful and satisfying knowledge of man. Knowledge of his physical world, its past, its present, and its future. And in your moments of relaxation, now and in the years to come, you will find the study of science leading you into fascinating pursuits. Photography, collecting. Why study science? Study science because you will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.